Hey YouTube viewers, happy January, hope everyone's doing well. Today we're going to be talking about the 50% rule. What the 50% rule is, just to break it down pretty quickly, is that you should be looking at properties that your mortgage payment should not exceed 50% of the actual projected rent for the unit. And why that rule is important, because I hear this a lot from other investors or from people interested in investing, is that they want to go ahead and rent out their house. And they say, oh, it'll rent for $2,000, and my mortgage is only $1,600, so I'm going to be banking $400 a month. And I tell them that that's not even close to how that works. We're going to go over all of that and kind of why that's important, and so that way you can be better prepared to be an investor as opposed to an accidental landlord. And I do think that there's a difference, and the difference really comes back to the margins. So before we get started, one of the things I'd like to ask everyone to do is that if any of this videos help in any way, please like or subscribe. That helps a lot. We really do appreciate that. I'm going to break out a PowerPoint, but it's only so that we can be looking at two examples of kind of breaking down the 50% rule. All right, so one of the properties we pulled up, this is on the MLS, had a purchase price of $159. You can find a number of mortgage calculation apps or even websites that'll break it down for you. I have an app that I use that works out really well, that I just put in the purchase price, the terms, and it breaks down what my payment would be. So this is without the property taxes, without insurance, and anything else. This is just the straight mortgage. So a 30-year mortgage at 4% with 20% down. Now this would be assuming that you're getting into an 80% loan, which means that you're probably going to be doing some good financing. Our payment would be about $607, and let's assume that it rents for $1,250 a month. So you'd look at that and say, okay, well, by the 50% rule, I'm doing okay. So this should be a great property to purchase. And then we have property 2 that you look at and say, okay, well, this one's a little bit more expensive, at $179, more money out of pocket, same mortgage, same terms at least. Now this one would rent for $683 a month, but it would be $683 a month, but it would rent for $1,300. So then that doesn't meet the 50% rule. Now there's a number of other things that we'd be considering, but just based on the 50% rule, these two, the first one does meet it, the second one does not. So the first one rents for $1,250 a month, but it also has HOA dues of $50 a month. That just changes our expenses by quite a bit. So $50 extra a month on top of that, which means that really we're only getting about $1,200 a month in rent. So now it's not as good 50% wise. But not everyone double checks their HOAs and their insurance to make sure that it's still going to be clearing that. This other one has no HOA. HOAs could be a big difference into whether or not something will work for your investment. So there's all the other associated costs that you have to go into. You have insurance costs. So what is it going to cost to insure the property? It's usually dwelling only. A lot of places it depends. It could be as $800 a month to $1,000, or $800 a year, $1,000 a year, that type of thing. Then you have the property taxes itself. So you have to look at the property taxes because, again, 2 different properties in 2 different counties can have completely different property taxes. This was very common in Virginia. We do see some differences like that here in Indiana as well. Utility holding costs, that would be for the month that it's needing to be rented. You are going to have utility holding costs, which are, you got to make sure that the water's still on, the electric's still on, that type of thing. It's not a lot of money, but it depends on how long you're going to be holding a property. Again, it's not uncommon to hold a property for 2 or 3 months without a renter. Property management, a lot of people will say, well, I'll do the property management myself. Okay, well, then just keep in mind that you are still incurring that cost in some way. You're moving into advertising, and then also for actually running background checks, credit checks, and then you also have the ways to process payments, all of that. There are a number of associated costs there still. Then you have the maintenance on the property. This is the, hey, my sink won't stop. The sink is leaking, the toilet is leaking. You have the filters in the HVAC. You have a number of different things that you have maintenance on depending on what you're doing. Now, a lot of people will try to move that cost back onto the renters. Problem with that is that every time you associate and move costs to the renters is that they just won't pay it. There's no reason to do it. It's not their house. They easily will just not do it. And then you have the capital expenditures. Now this is where most people go wrong, and they do not hold money back for major capital expenditures. I'll talk more about what that is maybe in a different video, but CapEx is a lot of different stuff. Then you also have the renovation costs once you purchase it. You can say, well, it's turnkey, so I don't have to do anything to it. That's not always the case. Whenever you're moving into rentals, there's a number of things that can easily change into a turnkey home. That is something that you need to change for a renter. Renters are more about durability. What if they were trying to bring in a pet? And you could say, well, I don't want to bring in pets. Okay, well, what about the mail? Is there anything about the mail that are associated with that you need to change? For instance, we have properties sometimes where packages are getting stolen, and so what we need to do is we need to go ahead and give them some type of secure lockbox. You could have a number of different things that might not be a huge expense, but you need to look at the renovations as if you were coming into it as a renter, and there usually is not none. Then you have the risk of capital loss from the house, and this would be another great video that I'll do later. But what I mean by that is that when you purchase a home, there's a number of risks associated with for the capital expenditures down the road. If an older the house is, the more likely it is that it's going to have certain things like electrical problems or plumbing problems. The roof, not just the age of the roof, but also the way the roof was laid. So depending on the angle of the roof, depending on what type of roof that's going to be used. Then you have foundations, and then not just hey, how good is the foundation, but the style of foundation. Slab homes are more expensive to renovate if there's any issues, because there is no way to get to the piping or anything below the home. So ideally crawls and basements are better to use than slabs. So that's what I mean by there's a risk to the capital loss of the type of home you've got. And those are things that we also have to look at. There's a lot of other things, and I'll probably do a whole video on that. So let's break down the numbers. The very first one, rents at $1,250 a month times 12 months, that's $15,000 a year. Okay, now you'd be $31,800 down to purchase it, and you'd be making $15,000 a year. That's before we pay all our expenses. So here's a breakdown of what that looks like. Income's $15,000. Vacancy is 1 month a year. That doesn't mean that you might not get renters that are staying for multiple years, but again, we want to make sure that we're going to be cash flowing. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for worst case scenario. This thing sits empty for a month every year. So you have vacancy of 8%. So now your income's down to $13,800. Now, if you get a property manager, they're going to take 10% plus 1 month's rent. It moves your income now down to $11,200 or $11,300. Now you have the mortgage debt service, the 607 payment times 12. Doesn't matter if there's nobody in it, you're paying that every month. So that's $7,200 a year. So if you do all that, you end up with about $4,000 left over. And you go, okay, well, $4,000, that's a good amount of money. And that's where people go wrong, is that they looked at just that. They still haven't taken out insurance, property taxes, holding costs, the maintenance, and the HOA. So then you get done with all of those expenses, and then you go, okay, well, I'm making $1,000 a year. That's not counting paying down the mortgage, not counting appreciation, equity. It's not counting that. This is just cash. But let's assume that we're making $1,000 profit. The problem with that assumption, again, is that you're not doing any type of capital expenditure holding. So you're not holding money for water heater replacement. You're not holding money for roof replacement. You're not holding money for major appliance problems, or you're not holding money for changing out carpets. There's a number of things that are capital expenditures that are larger expenditures for homes that you need to hold money for. And if you do all of that, you're not really making any profit at all. Most mom and pop, what they do is that they don't hold capital expenditures, and then whenever they have a problem, next thing you know, they just have to take it out of their own budget, and then they're like, wow, this house is really expensive. We just had to pay $10,000 for an HVAC system, heating, venting, and air conditioning, and that's way too expensive for a lot of people to just eat that cost out of nowhere. So let's look at property 2. Same idea, $179. This is more money out of pocket, $35,800, but it makes more money a month. So we're making $15,600. Break it down real quick. Makes $15,600. Vacancy 8%. PMI. Blah 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 blah. Same thing with debt service. It actually makes less a year than the other one does. It makes $3,500, but this one doesn't have the HOA. But let's assume that the insurance was the same and property taxes were a little lower, just by the fact that you start checking it into it and the property taxes are just a little bit lower, even though this house is more expensive. It could just be that it's in a different county and that county taxes differently. But you're still assuming the same maintenance, same everything else, but there's no HOA. But now what you're getting is about a 1.5 thousand in profit without CapEx. So even though this one actually didn't really meet the threshold of the 50% rule, it actually does look better than the other one does. So here, house 1, 31.8 down, profit of $1,000 a year. In house 2, 35.8 down, profit of 1.5 annual a year. But I don't like using the 50% rule because it's only passing the eyeball test. You now have to sit down and really crunch the numbers. But two of the other ones that people look at is the GRM, the gross rent multiplier. And so what that is it's the cost of the house divided by how much it makes in rent. And usually the lower number, the better. So it means you're getting the more bang for your buck. The problem with that is that it doesn't help you out with knowing how good the area is, how well it will rent, knowing how much money it's actually going to be out versus how much money in. So I look at, for all of ours, I look at cash on cash return. For the amount of money you pay for the amount of money it's going to make, what is that percentage? So I'm spending $31,000 to make $1,000. That cash on cash return is only 3.1%. That's terrible. The other one, at $35,000 down to make you $1,500 a month, that cash on cash is terrible as well. So I wouldn't have bought either of these. It doesn't meet the criteria, even though it's hitting close to the 50% rule. And the main reason why is that the cash on cash return is terrible. For instance, we won't pull the trigger on anything unless the cash on cash is over 10% at a minimum. Usually it's closer to 15%. So I test first. Does it meet the 1% rule? Meaning, if it's a $150,000 house, it rents for $1,500 a month. If it's a 1% rule, then maybe we'll go ahead and crunch the numbers some more. And then the 50% rule, making sure that you can get financing. Now, the 50% rule is important for looking at financing to determine what your financing amount will be. Because if your financing is going to be terrible enough that you can't get your rent below 50% of what the rent is, you can't get your mortgage payment below 50% of the rent, then it's a problem. And so we try to look at what our best options are for financing. So takeaways, 50% isn't always a rule, but it's a good benchmark. And it absolutely should be what you should strive for. And that the gross rent multiplier isn't the end all either. It's another good one to look at. But you need to look at all of it. It's total return, cash on cash return, debt service coverage ratios, which we'll talk about another one. But the difference is in educating yourself to be an investor as opposed to an accidental landlord. I know plenty of people who have rentals, and they were just because they lived in that house and then they moved out and they couldn't sell it for what they wanted to, so now they're renting it. Now they're making $100 or $200 a month, and they think that they're an investor, and they're not an investor. They're an accidental landlord because their margins are so tight that they're really not making any money. So some people live in areas in which you might not be able to rent very effectively. For a number of reasons. One is the fact that the homes are too expensive and you can't even really get started with financing. Two could also be that it's not even really a good area to rent. You're finding that all of your rents don't come close to the 1% rule. That happens. Up here in Indiana, there's a number of places where you can live where your rent isn't going to be close to the 1% rule. And what that means is that you can end up into a position in which you are not making any money on cash, but you plan on making all the money in equity or appreciation. I don't advise that. I think that you need to be making money through cash and appreciation, both, not just one. Saying that, hey, I could break even on this property and it'll appreciate down the road is very risky, because there's a number of problems with that, in case there's a problem with the house or in case the market doesn't go back up or doesn't go up the way you think. So I always advise people to try to look for both, not just one or the other. I encourage everyone to learn their market. I encourage everyone to find out if their market is not a good market, that they could find a good market that's near them. There's a number of investors and a number of books that I've read where people did not start in their local area just because it wasn't a good area for them, and then they opened up their search to areas within maybe an hour of them or even 30 minutes of them. And I think that that's the right call. You should be looking at, maybe you are in a good area, maybe you aren't. But the way to look at whether or not you're in a good area is by the 1% rule, the 50% rule. Start doing a little bit of number crunching yourself. Now, if you don't have a whole lot of money and you're trying to figure out where to go with it, find the deal first. Start finding deals, start learning your area, and what will happen is as you start meeting other people and start finding deals with that, there are ways that you can make money through wholesaling or by finding up and partnering with people. But this is where you start. One is, can you analyze a deal, and two, can you actually find a deal? And if you can't do that, then there's really no other place to start. And this part doesn't cost anything. It's just learning and getting more comfortable with the whole process. My goal today was to hopefully educate some of you on what a 50% rule was, because you'll hear a couple rules thrown out. 1% rule is a big one that people say. 50% rule, I've heard that one. 70% rule is the other one that people talk about. And the 70% rule is basically just saying that you should never be paying more than 70% of the actual or after repair value of a property. And that's mostly because your financing will only go up to 70% of the actual after repair value. So basically all your equity will come back out. I could do a whole nother video talking about that stuff too. But the key idea on all of this is to just start educating yourself a little bit so that you know what we're looking at and knowing why. Then we'll talk about what BRRRR strategies are, flip strategies, and how those different strategies work on making money. And then we can talk about all of that in other videos. If you ever have any questions on any of this stuff, if you have any questions on anything or would like to see me explain anything better, please let me know. I try to explain the deals I'm doing, and I am going to do a whole video on our very first deal and what that looked like. I think that'll probably be the next video that I do, so you guys can see that. That will be a longer video, but I'll explain the whole purchasing process, why we did that deal, how all of it went. But that gives you an idea of what all this stuff looks like. Hope everyone has a great day today, and again, I appreciate every single one of you.